Chapter 36. This is not a way to start a quest. Dare rubbed her eyes and tried not to yawn. She rolled her shoulders, unused to the weight of the backpack. You can sleep tonight, kid. Jacob chuckled. Now keep a straight face. She, Jacob, Kelin, Thistle, Phenon, and Selenian crossed under an archway and into an open grass corridor surrounded by trees on one side and a stream on the other. The cold wind threw a few gold and red leaves at their feet. Dare's gaze followed a leaf as it spun to the ground. There were far fewer of them to fall off their branches than a few days ago. The party was silent as they passed down into curving stone stairs that reminded her of a well. As they descended, the artwork faded, and the stairs became narrow and steep. The stonework looked ancient and smelled of moss. It gets slick ahead, the captain murmured. Watch your footing. Why? Dare asked. He pointed down. She bent at the knees to peer around the turn and realized that the encasing walls ended, but the stairway continued. She felt the blood rush away from her head on her next step down, and she pressed against the central pillar holding the stairs together. Below them, she could see the sliver of a river all the way down. She could hardly fathom that it was the same waterway they'd rode in on. She couldn't descry the waterfall from here, but she imagined how far it must plummet. The stairwell continued to descend over air. The wind whipped up around her, tearing at her hair and clothes with its icy fingers. Below, clouds crawled up toward the bottom of the mountains. It wasn't quite the abyss, Dare reasoned, but certainly a cousin. She gritted her teeth and forced a toe out onto the next step. I thought you elves, being immortal and all, having to risk a little more life than we mere humans would make this safer. Jacob, with both hands gripping the central spire, didn't look back. Well, they don't use this exit. From what they've told me, it existed before the Haven. How can you have a magical exit and not use it? Tree paths are safer, so we're using this because I doubt our alleged spy would consider it. Above her, the wind stole the surprised curses of Thistle and Kelin. It didn't matter. She knew what Kelin had meant to say, and she felt the absence of him right behind her. She didn't dare turn her head to see how far he was hanging back. Ahead, she saw the night vanish around the next bend. Swearing every half-inch, she followed. Jacob stooped in front of a small stone arch that marked a definite end to the stairwell. It looked hauntingly familiar, and she realized it was like the entrances to the graves of nobility she'd seen when she was young. Those squat mounds of rocks with that arch that was only large enough to slide a casket through. The night was grinning. Before she had time to shake her head, he grabbed her arm and pulled. She bit off a yell and slammed her eyes closed as she stumbled forward. Jacob released his grip, but it was too late. She was already moving through the arch. She crashed down onto something loose but solid enough. Her face slammed into the powdery and coarse ground. Salty scents washed over her, and she felt warmth tingling the back of her head. She raised one eyelid against the blinding light, and someone landed on her from behind. What the hell was that? Kelin yelped. He rolled off her back. Once she realized she could breathe, she tried to cough out all this bone-white stuff she had accidentally inhaled. She spat and spat. Then she sat up in wide-eyed wonder. Is this sand? Kelin asked, running his fingers through the fine grains. I've never seen sand like this. It's so light. Thistle, Phenon, Jacob, and Selenian followed, and neither Dare nor Kelin could mask their expressions of surprise as the others emerged from nothing but air. She stared back down at the sand upon which she sat. She hadn't ever imagined any place like this could exist. They were on a beach with trees boasting broad, green leaves. Many smaller bushes and other green growth choked the areas where they had taken hold. The sand could not have been more than 100 paces across, surrounded by water. She had never seen truly blue water before. She'd always heard the sea was blue, but not like this. It boasted shifting shades of royal blue and living green. She giggled at Kelin's dumbfounded expression as his gaze moved with the waves that were licking the beach. Then she tugged at her collar, realizing how much she was sweating and how her coat was already heating beyond comfort. She didn't see any animals other than birds and bugs. She glanced around. There was something she'd seen before there in the center of this new world. A circle of trees surrounding an older, larger tree. In this case, a palm tree. She pointed at it and glared at Jacob. "Tree path? But you said we could go anywhere." "I did," he replied. "Between Thistle and the spy, I wanted a few extra steps between us and where we're actually going." "I am not dropping any notes," Thistle whispered. "Oh, I never suggested that you and the spy were colluding," the knight chuckled. "Despite what all right, everyone in Riverfall was saying. I'm just being careful." "Where are we going, sir?" Dare asked. He rolled his eyes. "Nowhere special. A little place that Lady Eve divined." "That's not an answer, sir." "That's what you get." She wiped her forehead with her glove and sat, heating up in the sand. She found herself even more awestruck by this sandbar than she had been by the majesty of Riverfall. The knight captain clapped. "I wish we could stay, but alas, we've got to get our asses back into the cold." They lined up before the palm. While Jacob knelt in front of the tree, Dare swept her hands across her trousers and realized the sand was getting everywhere. Thistle whirled around, reaching for his sword. Selenian moved beside him, hand on his own weapon, but his eyes focused on the Kelin. "What is it?" The storm reader snorted. "I thought I heard something." Selenian shrugged. "A bird, perhaps?" "We're moving now," Jacob called. They each knelt and entered the tree. Once again they pushed through what felt like a fog curtain, and the cold on the other side sapped all the warmth Dare had just earned. Her sweat turned bitingly icy in a heartbeat. She hopped in place to try to regain some heat. Looking around, this terrain appeared much more like home, with its tree-lined, rolling hills sprinkled with an early snow. The clouds hung low, and she had to blink several times to focus. Jacob sighed and watched his breath turn into fog. "Come on." He trudged over the leaf-strewn, muddy soil. With wistful glances back at the tree, Dare fell in line with the party. Feenan began a song, making it up as they walked. The others picked up its simple, three-lined chorus. Selenian took the reins of the next verse. He sang about a tavern, the girl he met there, and the troubles that ensued when he encountered her other suitors. They sang the following chorus through their laughter. Thistle was the only one who remained taciturn. Dare cringed as she listened to Kelin try his voice, singing about when they would return home. Jacob took the verse after that. The song, with mismatched verses and horrible rhymes, continued and eased their march. As they walked, the hills grew tighter together and steeper, while the trees became fewer and shorter. Jacob called for quiet when they passed a marker of 3 rocks set up in a triangle. They treaded ahead in silence. Eventually, Dare trotted faster until she was even with the captain. "Will we be out this way for days, sir, or are we close?" "Close." She nodded, glancing at the hills as they squeezed the party into nearly single file. Jacob said, "Hey, sometimes you have to take that deep breath and go for it. It's a gamble, but we've stacked our deck enough." "Would you wager on that, sir?" He laughed. "No, probably not. War doesn't determine who is right, war determines who is left." Dare's mouth hung open and she blinked. She looked at her right hand and then her left. "That wasn't funny, sir." He smirked. "Got to make jokes when you can." He grunted under the weight of his pack, armor, and weapons as they began to push their way uphill again. He didn't say anything about the skeleton he had to step over. Dare stopped and stared, which caused the rest of the party to huddle around it. The bones were yellowed and falling away from each other, but it was still recognizably humanoid. She swallowed and burst into speed after the knight. The others followed without comment. "Where are we, sir?" She kept glancing over her shoulder at the long, rotted corpse. She watched Jacob look at her and then at the others. "Far away." "How far away, sir?" He grinned. "Oh, about ogre country far away." She gasped. He sliced his hand across his throat, motioning for silence. "Don't. Also, don't speak loudly, no songs, no fires, and we won't be here long enough for it to matter." "No worries," Dare drawled. They reached the crest of the hill. Below them, a wide, braided and brown river curved in from the horizon and disappeared. The swallow hole wasn't much. The ground dipped down and water flowed into it. Then, in a large, muddy ring, it vanished. Kelin's brow bunched up. "How does it happen?" Jacob grinned. "Not much to it, really. See, there's not so much water in this region, except for the river, of course. We're on limestone here, which cracks horizontally and vertically in what we call joints. This type of rock is permeable, so water creeps into it. The river falls into an enlarged joint and keeps going underground." Dare and Kelin both tilted their heads. "What?" Finan rolled his eyes. "He means there's a big crack in the ground and the water falls in." "How do you know that, sir?" Dare asked. Jacob stiffened, but then sighed. "I had a friend who liked rocks. I try to remember for the sake of his memory. It's not a passion of mine." "Huh." Kelin tapped his chin. "How do we get to Darkrain from here?" Dare glanced over her shoulder at the desolate landscape. "If we're not there already—" "No," the knight replied. "We're still in our world." Selenian cleared his throat. "Lady Evelyn instructed myself and Finan after her divination. The Swallow Hole is a thin place between worlds where crossing into Darkrain is possible. There are several around the world, and we never knew to look for them before this disaster. But she was able to see them in her trance." The elf's expression darkened, and he shivered. Finan continued, "They result from too many people making mistakes with too many spells, especially with transportation magic. The spoils had to dump somewhere, and it thins the walls of our reality." He sighed. "I imagine this is how the Kelin escaped." He glanced sideways at Thistle. The storm reader shrugged. The noisome air grew loud in their noses as they approached the swallow hole. Selenian pinched his nostrils closed. The ground squished more with every step. Jacob stopped. "Time for lunch." "At here?" Dare swung her head back and forth, searching for any signs of ogres. "Out here, we know the dangers. Once we get into Darkrain, only gods and Kelin know what's there." They slung off their packs, and Dare pulled out a brown package. It rattled when she shook it. "What the hell is this?" Finan chuckled. "That would be one of the many luxurious meals prepared for us." Kelin shook his own package. "Breadcrumbs?" Selenian half smiled. "Of course not. Perhaps a little. No, these are dried meals. All we need to do is add water." The humans stared at him. He held up his package and cut the wax that had kept it sealed. He poured in water from one of his skins. "I admit that I prefer these with hot water, but cool water is still fine." "What?" Dare's forehead wrinkled. Thistle rolled his eyes. "Like this." He poured from his water skin into the bag. "And now we wait." Finan asked, "How are you familiar with this?" Thistle met his gaze. "My wife." Kelin and Dare exchanged a glance. Finan forced a smile at them. "These are much lighter to carry." They used their water skins to fill their pouches. The river water could only taste worse than it smelled. Soon, the dried food began to soak up the water and became moist and looking like stew. As the party waited, they looked around at their surroundings. Dare murmured, "I see something back there." Jacob replied, "I hope that you're just on edge, but—" She watched. She was fairly certain she saw shadows moving against the wind, behind the trees, behind that rock. "That's good." She startled out of her concentration to see Finan sitting next to her, also watching, and she realized it was he who had spoken. "Take a good look around. It might be the last time." He waved his hand at the blanket of clouds. The light was leaking from the horizon. It was fast becoming night, and the world washed out to grey. Selenian stepped up beside them. "The storm rate is light. It's often said that this is when Kemeni's are the most acute." Thistle shrugged. Then he popped up from the ground, hand going for his sword. "Movement." The brush under the trees trembled, and a small figure burst from it, running as fast as his legs could carry him. "Fallon!" Kelin yelled. The boy stumbled as he closed the distance. "They're out there! They're coming!" He stopped short of diving in between his father's legs. "What's coming?" Finan whispered sharply. "Big things, teeth, smell like puke." Dare watched him stare up at his father in horror. "I'm sorry," he squeaked. "Ogres." Jacob removed the sheath from his axe. Thistle grabbed his son by the ear and yanked. He growled something in a language Dare did not know, and the boy's face paled even more. "Lunch is over." The knight crept forward with a grip on his axe. "We're going now." "But the boy," Selenian protested, wide-eyed. "We can't take him with us." "We can't leave him here," Finan retorted. Fallon banged on his father's leg with a fist. "Dad, you can't leave me behind. Not again." "Be silent," Jacob hissed. But it was too late. They already heard the rustling in the bushes and grass surrounding them. "Go!" A few crude, ugly logs of arrows thudded down short of their feet. They flew without precision but stuck deep in the soft soil. The party sprinted toward the center of the muddy ring, sinking farther into the ground with every step. Dare feared losing a boot as she slowed and descended to her knees in the mud. "We won't be able to breathe," Kelin yelled. "It's a break between worlds," Finan hollered. "Hold your breath and you'll come out the other side." Jacob waded toward the center and threw mud back with his hands. He sucked in a large breath and plunged face first into the muck. He vanished into the earth. Fallon, riding on Thistle's shoulders, beat on his father's head. "Go, go, Dare, come on!" More arrows spiked down around them, much closer this time. Dare pressed a hand against her drumming heart, fighting for every step forward. This would be the worst place to get stuck, she told herself. And also the most likely. She looked over her shoulder and saw the ogres. They were grey and bigger than she expected, and she had expected big. She had imagined they wielded spiked clubs, but these raised swords and maces as they charged. Maces that were larger than her entire head, she realized. 2 of them were shooting their bows. She whirled back around at the slurping mud. Ahead of her, she saw the ground swallow Thistle and Fallon. Finan and Selenian vanished next. Only she and Kelin remained. He threw out a hand. "Last boat out?" she asked as she grabbed his wrist. With all his blacksmith strength, he tugged her into the sucking river. Then the earth ate him, too. She hovered at the edge of the hole, taking rapid breaths. Even with the arrows and charging ogres, she hesitated. She heard the ground gulping down the water and felt it rushing around her, pulling her down. She inhaled one last time and held her breath. She took a step forward and let the world disappear beneath her feet. In the next instant, she was stuck with no way up or down. Water and mud slithered past her while the earth tightened its stranglehold on her body. She tried to kick and flail, but there was no space to move in. Suddenly, she slipped down and hit a rock with her feet, jarring every bone. As she continued to slide, the rock scraped up her legs and back. Icy water closed over her. It pulled her down faster, freezing her, and felt like thousands of tiny blades cutting into her skin. Is this it? She tried to push herself lower, but she was just floating. Her lungs were burning. Is this really it? Something gripped her ankle and yanked. Her shoulder slammed into a stone. She exhaled in shock, and her mouth filled with mud. Then someone plucked her out of the water by her ankle as if she was a small branch. A massive hand slapped her on the back. She coughed, spitting out heaps of mud. As soon as she could breathe, she was set down on a rough rock floor. She dimly recognized the captain's voice. "Dear, you're all right. Say something." She nodded and coughed again. "I'm here." Silty water dripped off of her hair, face, and clothes. She turned toward the hole in the ceiling. It was churning and water trickled down from it, but it wasn't the flood she had expected. Then again, it was nearly too dark to see anything. Only a splinter of light pierced its way into the room. He grinned. "That may not be a good thing." He glanced around. "That's all of us." "Yeah." Kelin squeezed his arms together. He looked like a mud monster. They all did. Dare squinted. It was hard to see clearly here, but the thought passed as she tried to focus on recovering her breath. She rubbed the mud against her clothing, trying to scrape off chunks. "So this is another world, yeah? Doesn't feel any different." Selenian pointed toward the light. She raised her gaze. It looked like they were in some sort of cave.
"Are the ogres following us?"
Thalin gripped his father's trousers and turned his face up to the muddy, swirling ceiling. Jacob shook his head. "I doubt it. If so, we definitely have an adventure. We left our packs behind," Feenan remarked. "Damn." The night captain snorted. "Oh well." Thistle glared at his son, who paled and looked ready to cry. Dare continued to blink, attempting to force her eyes to adjust. She pushed her wet hair back from her face, while her other hand rubbed the scratches she could reach on her legs. "It'll be impossible to get out against the current and mud." "I disagree," Selenian said. "It can be done, but not without effort." She shivered. She didn't want to try. Then she shivered again. The memories of the last time she was in a Kemen-controlled area chilled her mind as much as the water dripping off her clothing. This would be better, she told herself. She had resources, allies, and a plan. They tiptoed toward the mouth of the cave, squelching with every step. They slithered out into a forest. It appeared as any other forest in spring, although with few budding flowers among the scrawny trees. A crowd of bugs buzzed around them instantly. But they hardly noticed. They were all already staring in astonishment. They turned to Thistle, whose eyes were gray here, just like all of theirs. There was no color. Everything was a depth of gray, black, or white. Kelin clutched his arms against his chest. "If I had any hope of survival before, I don't now." "This is unexpected," Feenan whispered. Thalin bumped against his father's leg.
"Where are we?"
"You weren't supposed to be here." Thistle reached down and grabbed his son's shoulder. "We shall have words." He pulled the child back toward the cave. "Go deep. Hide." Then he turned to the others. "I will scout a path." Jacob hesitated, but nodded. The Kemen melted ahead into the Storm Reader's light. This was a whole realm of it. Selenian snorted. "This is a wicked place." Dare sat down. "Can we rest, sir?" Kelin asked through his panting. Jacob held up a hand. "I don't think that's a good idea." The buzzing of insects grew louder as the flies descended on them. Dare swatted at a few of them as they picked at the drying mud on her skin. No matter where her gaze roamed, the trees seemed brittle, with scrawny leaves clutching drooping branches. Then she gave up while they waited for Thistle. Finan threw his hand toward his sword. "I hear something." Dare hopped to her feet and tried to imagine what beast might be coming for them. But she couldn't picture anything but those attacking ogres as they watched. Finan shook his head. "I'm sorry, everyone. I suppose I was overeager." Dare shrugged. Then she froze, listening. She was certain she had heard, "No!" She stamped her foot, but a resounding echo didn't ring. Thistle stepped out from the forest. Around him, at least a dozen other Kemen appeared from behind the trees. "You bastard," Jacob breathed. He pulled his axe free. Thistle said nothing. None of the other storm readers even glanced at him. Jacob raised the axe. Dare stared at him, hand on her sword and ready to draw. She was afraid to blink, afraid she'd miss the signal. He raised his other hand and held the axe out, away from his body. Dare's eyes widened and she shook her head. Beside her, Kelin collapsed to his knees. "Not again, not again." Selenian raised his sword. It landed on the soil next to his feet. "Not like this," she raged. "Not without a fight." She ripped her gaze toward Thistle. "How could you?" But that doubt had been there all along, she realized. Selenian turned. He had paled and his eyes had almost rolled up in his head. He ducked under a Kemen blade and shoved his way past, scrambling for the cave at a full sprint. But she couldn't spare him attention as she felt the wind of a blade on her face. She lurched sideways from the attack. She crouched underneath a beheading swipe and sliced upward at her assailant's body as she drew her sword. It was a lucky slash, and the Kemen hopped back. She didn't have time to try to finish him, though. She was already parrying another storm reader. But the lack of color was too disorienting, and she overcorrected her sword, swinging her entire body off balance. "Dare stop!" She froze at the thunder in Jacob's command. The sword she hadn't even seen coming halted at her neck. She struggled for a breath, eyeing the blade. "Drop it," Jacob ordered. She heard the dull thump of his axe landing on the ground, followed by his sword and shield. From the corner of her vision, she saw Kelin on his knees, staring ahead in horror. Finan tossed down his blade and stepped back while raising his hands. "No," she wheezed. But her traitor fingers unwrapped themselves from her sword. It fell.